Hi, everybody, and welcome to the latest edition of Pep Talks Manager Livestream. The point of these streams and what we try to do every month is explore how to build winning teams in a hybrid world. Obviously, for any of you who know who I am, you'll know that my background is in psychology, and I've worked in sport over a number of years in three different continents. But my role now is with Pep Talk. I am Chief of Global Partnerships, and really my role is kind of about us as we scale up into the US and other markets, that we kind of build the relationships. And obviously I have experience of working with some remarkable people. And one of the things that I'm really interested in is the idea of leading with intentionality, empathy, and care, which is the title of this today. And I'm joined by three really, really wonderful people, excellent leaders, all in their own right, all with very, very different backgrounds and skill sets. First off, I'm going to introduce Jen Kirkwood. Jen is a partner at IBM and Global Data and Digital Head of Strategy. Hi, Jen, how are you?
I'm wonderful. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our audience.
Indeed. Welcome from a ridiculously early hour in Las Vegas.
Yes.
Jen is speaking to us from the HR Tech Conference this week, so this is very exciting for us. I'm also joined by Jim O'Toole. Jim is a friend and a man with massive experience in the leadership world. He is currently the CEO of Bord Iascaigh, which is for our American guests, it's Irish or Gaelic, as you would call it, for the Fisheries Board. And Jim is the incoming CEO of Bord Bia, which is the food authority in Ireland. Jim, congratulations on your new role and welcome to the panel.
Thank you, Niall, and I'm sure the audience will appreciate the little lesson in Gaelic as well. But
yes, indeed, yeah. And last, but by no means least, is Mike Robbins. Hey, Mike, how you doing?
I'm good, Niall. How are you?
I'm great, man. It's good to see you. Mike is a multiple best-selling author, an executive coach, predominantly done a lot of work in the likes of Silicon Valley. One of the best at his trade in the US, I would argue. Mike also has a really, really interesting take on, I suppose, like my interest is always in the word pivot, but it's kind of responding from disappointment and redirecting your life. And Mike was a Major League Baseball player whose career was cut short through injury, and has found a way to channel his skill set and his talents into something where he helps other people achieve success now. So a really, really impressive panel. One of the things I think is kind of interesting when we talk about intentionality, and it's a word that I hadn't really come across an awful lot, to be honest, until I started talking with a company called Grow Remote, who are very much focused on helping organizations deal with the remote world. And one of the things they were speaking about was this idea that when you have a meeting, that you do it with an intention, with an idea to getting a result. That things become more about strategically, there's a reason we all get together. Jen, from your point of view, I suppose if we start off thinking about leading, like if we talk about intentionality or empathy or care, why do you think these things are important for leaders in this modern hybrid world?
Oh, great question. I think more than ever, we've had, since the pandemic, the real focus and this lens on the workforce. And more than ever, there's this myth out there that people attrit, and I see the data, that people attrit and that talent will be attracted by compensation. And I hear it and I deal with senior leaders talking about this. And in the government sector too, of government feeling like they can't compete in the private sector and in this world that we deal with. And that's such a myth, because when you look at the purpose of this intentionality and the empathy and the care, it all goes to leaders. Because the top three reasons that talent will be attracted or that talent will attrit are three things: flexible work, hybrid work; two, in environmental, social, and governance, the ESG purposes, which is largely culture, that I believe in my employer, that I'm doing meaningful and purposeful work. And then leadership, who I work for, and who is my team. And then last is the fourth piece of compensation. So the top three pieces are all about that careful placement of that compassion, the empathy, and that leader. And if that leader, the coaching, the development, and the performer of that leader is not the focus, then we've lost everything within the top three reasons as to why care for talent right now. And since the pandemic, that lens is magnified. And so one of the pieces that we look for right now in the boards that I'm working with the executive leaderships I'm working for, is first line leaders, second line leaders. And the data is the data. And all the trend analysis goes back to the inference on the leader.
Yeah, it's so true. And it's actually interesting that I saw, I think I mentioned it in the last stream we did, that Gallup had done research, and the three words that were most common for people in reasons why they stayed with an organization was trust, social cohesion, and purpose. Yep. And Jim, I know you're a big believer in that from the point of view of, you've worked with such a variety of organizations, and in your current role with the Fisheries Board, you're dealing with, you've got remote workers who are in boats out in the ocean, and you've got guys working in factories, and you've got people working in an office, and like there's a real juggle. And we were just talking offline that I was kind of educated by, there's a professor in Oxford University that I did some research with, and I have a podcast show called Works Broken, cheap plug. And the reason I call it Works Broken is I feel like we've been working this industrial revolution model for 100 years, and we're now in a massive state of change, and it doesn't work anymore. But what he educated me on is that Works Broken, in his view, was a very middle class view of work. It's very much about white collar office work. And Jim, you have massive experience of all aspects, like all the different kind of sides of it. Do you see that kind of what Jen is just talking about? Have you seen that firsthand, about the ideas and the ideas of trust and purpose, and that being key to a happy workforce, I suppose?
Absolutely. No, I thought Jen's commentary was very, very interesting, because I work in the government sector, and my organization is a public service organization. And that inability to compete with the private sector is something that is often spoken about. But I would agree with you very much, Jen, that what motivates the people that work in my organization is very much about the purpose that they feel, and they have. We work at a technical level with a development lens with people that work in wild catch fishery, in agriculture, and in processing. And their technical understanding and empathy for that sector is something that gives them purpose, and it overrides a lot of other values that might be attributed. So I think in the new, I was just saying to Niall before the show, what I think is really interesting is that in thinking about this world of work and hybrid world of work. The people that we work with, that their world hasn't changed, and they haven't made this transition. So it's very important for us to understand that client comes first, but also how we make that easiest for our workforce, our colleagues, our teams to be more empathetic with them, and how we can make sure that we're setting up an environment and a culture that we allow people to give their best. And I think that's really important, rather than this maybe previous paradigm that we had, where you clocked into your office and you went home, whereas it needs to be completely different.
Like you, thanks, because we hadn't compared notes ahead of time, so.
Yeah, we're all aligned. A carefully selected panel, Jen. No dissenting voices. Mike, you work with a lot of organizations that have very different aspects to them as well. What have you seen in your work, particularly with the executives in these organizations, as the kind of the challenges are facing around building this kind of environment?
I mean, I think, I love what Jen and Jim are both talking about. I mean, a lot of it depends on the environment, the industry. And look, in a pre-COVID world, a lot of the companies that we work with in Silicon Valley, I would talk to leaders, whether it was executives all the way down to, mid or frontline managers. And one of their biggest struggles was, how do I manage people remotely versus the people that I'm, managing in person? Now, COVID happens, and especially for a lot of white collar, tech jobs, everybody went home and everything was virtual. And that became an enormous challenge because most people didn't know how to do that, and still are now struggling as we're going back. And it's this hybrid thing. And I have some people here and some people there and some people everywhere. And what I'd been saying for years prior to COVID was like, look, managing people remotely is obviously harder than managing people in person for a whole bunch of reasons. You just have to be that much more intentional. And you have to really work on building your relationship with someone in an authentic and effective way if you're not going to see them around the office and for lunch and all the ways that we would interact. I think everybody's been dealing with that dynamic. And in some cases, Jim, to your point, some people's lives didn't change all that much, quite frankly, in terms of how they worked and where they worked, whereas other people's, right, Jen, at IBM and other places, it disrupted it significantly, and it's still very disruptive. But I think, again, if we come back to a lot of what Jen was talking about, the reason why people stay engaged, the reason why people leave or are attracted has a lot less to do with compensation and other things we think. It has a lot more to do with their relationship with their manager. I mean, the old adage, people don't quit their job, they quit their boss. So I say a lot of times to leaders, like, what are you doing to invest in your relationships? And we also have to acknowledge it is a lot harder these days because just the nature of how we work and how we communicate. It's back-to-back Zoom calls where people don't have a lot of in-between time just to go and connect and check in with each other, which is a lot of ways that in the past we were able to express our empathy, our care, our concern, and show that intentionality. Now we have to do it in a much more structured and sort of disconnected way.
Yeah, and isn't it interesting? Like, I mean, I would always be a believer from the work, from the incredible coaches and leaders I worked with in sport, that great leaders are ones who care.
Yep.
And I always have to reinforce that message with the fact that I don't mean you care like we all go off toasting s'mores and cuddled up on a couch giving each other hugs and stuff like that, but that you care enough to be honest, and you care enough to be direct, and you care enough to be straight. And Mike, you do a lot of coaching with like senior leaders of big organizations. When you're talking about care or empathy, how do you communicate that message so they understand that it's not about being, soft, I suppose, or fluffy? It's about, leading. Like the word intentionality is going to keep reoccurring in this conversation. I can sense, but it's about that thing about there's a purpose, there's a reason, but we're being direct and honest and straight with you.
Yep.
And once you build that trust with someone, they'll go a long way on a journey with you.
Totally. I mean, I think a lot of times with care, you think about the people who we care about in life and who care about us, whether it's at work or outside of work. It's usually not communicated. I don't say, oh, I really care about you. You really matter to me. We show it to people. We listen to people. We ask questions. We're interested in what's going on with them. Now, to your point, sometimes we have to have what I call sweaty palm conversations with them. We tell them things that they need to hear, whether they want to hear them or not. And we do it with compassion, with empathy. But I think caring about people is much more demonstrated than it is actually communicated. And again, when we're limited to only communicating with people or interacting with people virtually or in a text message or an email or over, Skype or Teams or whatever platform we're using, we have to be that much more intentional about it. And so a lot of the leaders that I work with too, we talk about how do we create time and space when we connect one-on-one or even as a group, where we're actually talking about people's lives and really checking in, because we've all been through quite a bit over the last couple of years. And although things are getting better, I think there's still a lot of PTSD that people are dealing with and navigating through some real challenges, both at work, but also in life in general.
Yeah, Jen, it's it's one of the reasons I love listening to you guys talking, because you all come at something where there's a little bit of confirmation bias, because you're speaking the stuff that I believe, but you're also giving me a very different perspective on it. And Jen, from your perspective with your work, you know, how do you feel you lead with intentionality and care, or what do you think is the key message for organizations, you know, as hybrid seems to be here to stay? So what is the philosophy, do you think, for leaders in building that kind of intentionality and care into their workplace?
Well, I'm going to warn you, I'm going to be pretty direct here in this
Cool.
audience, that I'm going to be a little bit beyond now. It's about the warmth and the caring. It's more than the quiet quitting. It's more than the trends of talking about hybrid work. It's now, okay, we're coming off the pandemic and we have new issues of mental wellness, yes, as to what Mike just thoughtfully said, but it's also now psychological safety, and it's diversity, equity, and inclusion. And thinking about those issues in terms of compassionate leadership, I really would encourage leaders to think about, in all industries and in all sectors. And, you know, I've worked with slaughterhouses to crab fishing boats to, you know, cross-sector globally, a smattering of different pieces. And in this new hybrid work, the intentionality of thinking about psychological safety and DE&I more than ever in mental wellness means, you know, the specific day-to-day actions. First, the executive leadership that we need from the helm all the way down in that commitment is more than sending surveys to some of your new leaders and saying, yes, we're a best place to work for diversity. It is now teaching the actions of all of the leadership down, that when you go to a meeting, it's, yes, a purposeful meeting, but it means that from a day-to-day basis, are you asking women, and notably women of color, to take notes in that meeting that someone else could do? That in that WebEx meeting, that you're making sure everyone can join that meeting and nobody is left out from a woman or a people of color and having to re-ask for the invite to the meeting. Like, the specific actions and intentionality in this hybrid world need to be considered, because that leads to the disengagement, to the attrition issues, or to the, I don't want to work for my leader, or I'm not included in my team. And to all the top 3 reasons that we just said are the marks of high attrition and retention issues. That diversity, equity, and inclusion is the action part to that compassionate leadership. And when women are still, you know, white women are still paid at executive roles $17,000 less than an executive white male. But women went down on 84 cents in the dollar that they were paid pre-pandemic. They've gone down, and that's white women, not women of color. That's not African American, Latinx, or any of the other profiles in ethnicity. That's all deprecated tremendously. That's also the women that have left the workforce that were rumored to have come back. But what they've come back to in this hybrid world has been a very different type of world, that inclusivity and the specific actions need to now be retrained and rethought in compassionate leadership. And it starts with, I had a room full of C-suite executives, and there was about 45 C-suite executives in the government space that were talking to me specifically about 2 months ago, how do we compete with the private sector in recruiting? All right. And one of the last pieces actually that we talked about in terms of specific actions they could take is, I said, how many of you have told your leadership how to have midline leaders that would then go down to first line leaders, how to have an effective one-on-one, and then how to have an effective one-on-one, and taught career pathing in technical roles with women? And in technical roles specifically, not that this doesn't apply to hourly mid-level leaders, is there career pathing forum, whether it's a lattice movement or an upward movement? Because traditionally in the technical space, these roles are held by men in the government sector. So how are we having these type of inclusive conversations, and have we given leaders the ability to have them from a coaching perspective? Because I want to see action now. Let me pause for some thoughts.
No, that's such a powerful statement, and you're right. And it's fascinating. I see a lot with, I do a lot of leadership work with organizations, and there's a lot of worries about mid-management and how do we equip our midline managers to deal with all this stuff like hybrid work and that. And I also see a lot of investment in D&I, but D&I being the D. So there's an investment in diversity in that organizations will do what looks right. hire people based on color, or they'll hire more women, or they'll hire people with disabilities because it suits the trend of being able to say, oh, look, we're taking care of D&I. But there is no thought given to inclusion. And I did a talk yesterday morning with a woman who's an expert in neurodiversity. And it was a fascinating chat to listen to her talk about the ways of making the workplace more inclusive for somebody. You know, we're all neurodiverse, if the truth be told. Every one of us is different, and Jim knows me well. You know, we all have our challenges. Yeah. But it's that thing about, you know, there's a slide we have there, and I might stick it up and show it to you. And it was about creating a compassionate culture. And really, it's about, I would say it's almost about building an inclusive culture. But when you talk about identifying blind spots, that's kind of like the simple things, like in communicating with your people about how do you want to be communicated with. Like from a neurodiverse point of view, does email work better for you? Do phone calls work better for you? Do Zoom calls work better for you? Simple things like that, involving people in decisions. And I think one of the challenges that I've seen over the years that where women were being held back from the C-suite was there was a kind of a model of how the C-suite should be. And that was created by, you know, white male, you know, 50-somethings. And breaking through that kind of expectation of what C-suite should be was the first step in trying to get women, you know, more access to these roles. But involving them in the decisions and involving, you know, people of race in decisions around what kind of direction the company should go. And I mean, there's a whole argument around remote working that people with disabilities should have no barrier to the workplace if the traditional barriers of accessibility to a building doesn't exist anymore because they can work at home. So it's all about that kind of understanding these different areas. And Jim, for you as a CEO, you know, it's always really interesting when you get people from different perspectives. You have the challenge of managing a workplace that's very, very diverse. And understanding the challenges you have in bringing people in, making this thing function, but also making sure that your organization, you know, I mean, the obvious thing about diversity is that, you know, how can you understand what your customer wants if you don't have the representation of your customers in your organization? How have you kind of challenged that, and how do you work around that in your organization?
I think the conversation has been really interesting, and I like the way that it has, you know, I think Jen and Mike have talked about, you know, care and empathy sound perhaps a little abstract, and the idea that it has to have a hard edge to it, or it has to, you know, it has to get and I think that in my experience, an organization really responds to authentic leadership, and I think that really resonates. That this is not talk. This is there is an intentionality about how we're going to address that. And we've started doing some work in our organization, and we're a relatively small, as I say, Irish government agency around EDI. And what has fascinated me about it is that just asking for volunteers to get involved in a working group, the richness of experience that people can bring to that from their varied personal lives, and that there are colleagues that have a relative or a partner who have different challenges, and there is an enormous wealth of experience and understanding and depth of the nuance of how that is, because I think sometimes the EDI conversation can be too stereotyped, and it can be, whereas it's not about. It is, of course, about gender and race and socioeconomic and different people with different challenges. But when you mix all those things together into one person, which is, you know, what our colleagues are experiencing both in their own personal lives and the people they interact with, that is how you draw that out. And, you know, in some respects, it's very simple. It's just listen to what a wealth of experience that exists in your own organization, and let that have a channel that it can influence how your organization works. I think to me it's been really interesting and powerful, the learning that's there, in that a lot of the time your colleagues know the answers because they're living it, or their partners or their relatives are living it, and it's there under your feet in some respects.
And it's funny, isn't it? Like, you're right. There's such a wealth of experience within the organizations, and yet sometimes we go and we look to consultants and we look to kind of reports and reviews to try and get our head around something. And actually, it's part of the inclusivity is the sitting down and listening to what your own people's experiences are. Mike, I know you're passionate. I love Mike's books, and I would recommend everyone go out. At least one of them, or probably all five. But they all speak about kind of bringing the best version of yourselves to the workplace. And this is something that you and I have spoken about from a sporting perspective.
Yeah.
Because my experience of working with athletes was always that if you took care of the distractions in your personal life, you were more likely to turn up to perform in a better headspace.
Yeah.
And it was kind of that, like, and I would always talk about distractions as being like everything is a potential distraction. It could be huge, or it could be like just your phone buzzing in the middle of a conversation. Distractions are, it's not to belittle what they are, but it's to understand how they impact on you in the now.
Yeah.
You do an awful lot of work with people around that kind of idea of getting them present.
Yeah.
Listening to what's being said around you, but being present in those moments. And sometimes the problem is, and like for someone like Jim, who's an extraordinarily busy man and has so many different balls he's juggling at the same time, it's being in the room and hearing that from a CEO perspective. Because what happens is you might have groups within the organization where middle managers will do something. A senior leader might pop in. But if you don't have people present in the room listening, that message will never reach the CEO. Right. So the C-suite will never change if it is open to change. Yeah. Is that your experience?
Yeah. I mean, and I think, it's interesting what we're talking about in terms of being present, but also even in terms of inclusion. I do think a lot of my work and a lot of my research actually focuses on paradox, that if for us to have a sense of confidence in ourselves, but also even in the team, we have to have enough, as Jen talked about, psychological safety to be able to admit when we're not feeling confident, right? I mean, so I played professional baseball, Niall, as you mentioned, and one of the lessons that I learned after I got done playing was I dealt with a lot of fear and anxiety as an athlete. And it wasn't because I didn't have confidence and I wasn't good. It was simply because I didn't realize that part of the process of competing at something at a high level like that is going to elicit a certain amount of anxiety and insecurity. We just never talked about it. Yeah. So I was sitting around with my teammates and we're all acting like we're confident, but in reality, all of us to some degree were dealing with a certain amount, if not a significant amount of insecurity. And what I find when I'm working with leaders, even really senior, very smart, talented people, is if they can sit in a room with each other and actually acknowledge some of their fears and doubts and concerns about the business, about what's happening, about what's going on personally. Ironically, what that does is not only connect them more with each other, but it breeds more confidence. Mm-hmm. Because if we know it's okay to say, I'm scared, or I don't know what I'm doing, or I screwed that up, what's actually going to happen is give us more space and more permission then to take that risk, try to do something, ask for help, partner, and collaborate. And I think sometimes, even when we're talking about DE&I, which we were just talking about, of the many challenges we have in really dealing with that is we don't actually talk about it all that openly and honestly because it's scary. If I'm someone who's in, the majority as a straight white man as I am, part of the fear is I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't want to do the wrong thing. I don't want to offend people. I don't want to use the wrong term. I don't understand all of what this means or how this feels. Or maybe I'm not paying attention to it because it's not in my day-to-day life of thinking about that. If I'm female or I'm a person of color or I identify as being a part of one or more non-dominant groups, of course, I'm not only thinking about that all the time, that's my lived experience. I have to navigate the world that way. Mm-hmm. And as Jen knows better than the three of us know, I don't want to be the woman that's always raising my hand and talking about gender, right? I don't want to be the person of color that's always like, hey, are we going to have the diversity conversation? Because then it's like, I don't want to get branded. It's hard enough to get in the room. And then I'm the person that's always ringing the bell, which I want to do on the one hand. But on the other hand, I also want to get work done and I want to just be part of the team. So it's this challenging thing to navigate that impacts all of us in different ways. And we have to figure out how we talk about these things authentically and effectively. And that's not easy to do. And then we lay the pandemic on top of it, and we're all just kind of swimming in trying to get work done and trying to make things happen. So there's a lot happening for just about everybody these days.
Yeah, for
The
sure.
interesting thing, if I may, from the HR Tech Conference, which has just been fantastic, is some of the major trends that are coming out of it. And if you look at all the analytics vendors that are there, is DE&I. And one of the reason being is that, and truly speaking of just the pro, so many boards being, as you eloquently shared, Mike, is that they're white male boards across the globes that are stepping in now to say, I know we have to have these conversations because it's so important now to getting the right talent, not just because it's the right thing to do. And we've had so much social awareness from different events across the world that have come up on the headline TVs, and we know how important, but the innovation impact in having diverse teams has been proven to have material financial yield from a metrics component on our products, our customers. So it's the right thing to do, but it is the competitive and brand and customer impact thing to do, right? So there's a financial KPI impact. So one of the top themes in DEI and the what is on the floor as to what everyone is asking for. It's one of, I think, one of the top 3 things. It's one of the top pieces I get asked for, because if you think about it, everyone wants to tell me who's going to leave my organization. Well, you know, do you really want to know that? They're kind of like, ship has sailed. It's a little late if they're leaving. Let's talk about why people are staying. And if there is unrest as to things that they would like better, let's look at the trend analysis as to why, and let's elevate it up. And they want the psychological safety. They want to work with the teams that they love. And their manager is one of the key reasons that people stay. So what is that manager doing that we can replicate? And the key reasons are around this and the inclusivity and the pieces that we see repetitively on the managers that do right. And truly, even the white male managers that do right, they're asking the inclusive questions of their team and saying, teach me. You know, their diverse team saying, teach me. And it starts with that. And the HR executives, and I'll tell you, we had such an executive, the first Black CHRO in the NBA, the National Association, for the Dallas Mavericks here. I thought you guys would love this, Niall and Mike. I was like, this has your name all over it. Her name's Cynthia Sint Marshall. And she's, again, the first Black CHRO in the NBA league. And like, she's knocking the socks off. And in the first 100 days, it was a tolerance for bad behavior, right? You invite me to this party, you teach me how to dance, she said. And then she shared with all the HR executives kind of like her plan for the all-in type of plan. And HR, I mean, I think the misnomer is, yep, we're doing DE&I. But are we really? Because if you're doing DE&I, it's not just this legal metric you throw out in your 10K, 8K annual report. It's you're doing this from the inclusivity piece, right? And it's that inclusivity to the empathy and the compassion. And Mike, what you just shared, and I will say, because going through your videos and your books, like you have a TED Talk out there that I think is absolutely eloquent, where you said to a female professional, you know, you're kind of making me awkward. Like, I feel uncomfortable. Remember you shared that talk? I don't know if you finished a little bit about that.
Yeah. I mean, I think, look, it comes down to, at some level, I talk in one of my TED Talks, I talk about actually being in a meeting with my publisher and being really nervous and trying to, you know, I'm pitching a book, and then, you know, I look at her and she's the president of the publishing company that I didn't know was coming to the meeting, and just like, hey, I noticed that I'm feeling really nervous. Can I stop doing that and just be myself now? And one of the things that I have found, one of the antidotes for us in dealing with some of these difficult, challenging, but important conversations is where we have common ground as human beings is what I call below the waterline on the iceberg, just our real emotional experience. And again, I only know what life, look, I'm a 48-year-old straight white American man who lives here in the San Francisco Bay Area. I've traveled around the country and around the world. I feel like I've learned a lot of things, but I only know what I know. And I can't ever know what it's like to be, right? Niall and Jim, you all live in a different part of the world we're all interacting with people from all over the place who are very different. Sometimes they look different than us, or sometimes they just have a different background or a different perspective. But I think as we lower the waterline on the iceberg, what I mean by that is just we get more real, we express and expose a little more of who we are. What we find is the paradox of, on the surface, we're very different. Down below the surface, the further down below the waterline we go, the more similar we become. Because what's down there is hope and fear and excitement and sadness and joy and pain. And I think if we've learned nothing over the last couple of years through the pandemic, it's that we're all dealing with stuff. And some of us are dealing with stuff that's very different than what other people are dealing with. But ultimately, I think embracing that paradox of being very different and understanding the differences, but at the same time, having way more common ground with each other as human beings than we realize, that's how leaders can really be more compassionate and understand. And even when people are upset, or even when people are super frustrated, you can hear those frustrations or those difficulties and not necessarily get defensive about it and have to talk them out of it, but just listen to where they're coming from. Because it's like, oh, I may not have that same complaint or that same frustration, but I know what it feels like to be frustrated and to feel like I'm not being heard or nothing's happening. So can I have some empathy for that? And can we meet somewhere where there is some common ground, and then try to figure out how we're going to solve these problems together?
Yeah, for sure. And it's funny, you know, we had a lady called Sam White on a call a couple of months ago, and Sam is she's owns a bunch of insurance companies in the UK and in Australia, and she's a remarkable woman, incredibly successful entrepreneur, but she fired herself as CEO of one of her companies, and she had a corporate psychologist working with her as a coach, and she ended up firing herself and hiring him as the CEO. And he took the role on the understanding that he wasn't going to make any decisions. And this is where we're going to get into the whole kind of, you know, understanding what the future world of leadership looks like, and to tie in everything that you guys are talking about. And Jim, I'm going to throw this at you just to kind of, you know, make you massively uncomfortable. But
thank you.
But what they were thinking about was his job is he has a senior leadership team around him, and he asks them questions, and they make decisions. So he facilitates their decision-making process by kind of managing the conversations, but they're making the decisions. The productivity in that company has gone through the roof, and she maintains it's the single smartest decision she's made in her business career. And she's a very smart woman. But I just think it's a really great example of how the role of CEO has changed and is changing. And when we talk about inclusion, like the single biggest thing is that as CEO, and Jim, I don't know how you've seen it change in your time, but as CEO, the traditional thing is you're expected to have all the answers. Whereas, you know, a future CEO should have all the questions. But you hired people to give those answers. The simple thing from my perspective is you work with an athlete, you know, everybody talks about strengthening your weaknesses. I'm kind of going, no, build on your strengths. Yeah. We'll hire to cover your weaknesses. Let's build on, like, if you're really good at this, why, like, just say, for example, I'm a very creative person. Why would you want me spending hours of my day doing spreadsheets and creating reports and looking at data? That's not me. Jen, you are an absolute master at data analysis and strategic thinking. I'm a creative. You come to me with the data and the strategy, I'll go nuts on how we create it. But the smart leadership thing is to go, okay, well, you do that, and we'll bring you together when we need to build something different. Jim, have you seen a big change in the kind of the role of the leader in the time, you know, in your very short career, because you're obviously very young?
I'm very, of course, I am very happy to confirm that I have very few answers, and I've lots of questions, and I'd say that with no fear, Mike. But I think, you know, I feel that I'm doing my job better is when I am digging in, not just to my senior leadership team, but to the next layer in the organization, and asking them the questions and seeking their insights, because that's where the solutions come from. And I think that the role of the CEO is to ask those questions, and then to be able to step back and maybe kind of to build the mosaic of the different perspectives, and to try and make that a little bit more coherent, and then to bring people with you and to understand it. I really like to just have to go back on something that Jen said earlier. I really like her commentary about inclusion and inclusivity being something that makes business sense, rather than something that we have to check a box or do it in a defensive way. And because there is so much for all our organizations to learn and to add value by understanding that, because we are ultimately connecting with our customers, who are these people. So it makes abundant sense to me, but clearly there's a lot of work to be done in that area.
Yeah. Sure.
We've changed our brands, our logos, the customer, the syrup, the butter, to make our customers feel more inclusive. Why would we not do this for our workforces and our people, right?
Yeah. Well, and on that note, I think it's also like, if we take it even out of the space of DE&I and think about it just in terms of what we're talking about compassionate leadership, ultimately about culture and sort of creating a great place to work. I mean, all of the things that, the softer side, for years, I mean, I've been doing this for 22 years, and I've always been really passionate about how do you tie all this stuff to performance? Because at the end of the day, I mean, again, as a former athlete in most of the companies I work with, it doesn't matter if it's in the tech world or if it's in the, financial world, or it's in the healthcare space, or even with nonprofits and some of the educational organizations that I work with that aren't so much about bottom line results. They want to perform at the highest level. They want to be the best version of the team they can possibly be, because if it's a nonprofit, they feel like their mission is to impact the world in a significant way. And if we can come in, or I come in as an outsider, or those of you working inside of organizations, and say, hey, look, we want to talk about these messy, soft topics that are hard, by the way. I mean, soft skills are really hard, let's be honest. But let's look at, not only do we do these things because they're, again, Jen, right, as you're talking about, the right thing to do, we do them because they actually make us better and make us perform better. In the political world, they often talk about, it's not only good policy, it's good politics, right? This is a good policy that's going to help people, but it's actually good politics because people like it, right? And if you take it out of the political realm, it's more like, hey, this isn't just the right thing to do because it looks good and sounds good, and there are some social trends saying we need to do this. This is actually going to help us be better at what we do. And isn't that ultimately the goal? And there, I mean, McKinsey did a study just a few years back, and Jen, I'm sure you have a lot of data that shows this, but like delivering through diversity, they showed that like diverse teams are 33% more effective, more productive in terms of bottom line results than non-diverse teams. So it's like, you don't even have to care about it as an issue for yourself and think that it's the right thing to do, but it's like, do you want your team to be better? Okay, well, here are some things to do that. Or again, if you think about all the data that we've seen over the last couple decades about how important culture is to not only keeping the right talent, but having the team perform, it's like, why wouldn't you invest in that? And it is an investment of resources and also of time. But a lot of times, like, I'll be with a team at an offsite and I'll say to them, do any of you have the time to be at this offsite? No, none of you do. You have a million things to do. This is like inconvenient for your schedule and all of the deliverables. But if you don't take this time to be together, you're not going to be a successful team. And you know that because you've been on some dysfunctional teams where people don't trust each other or like each other or communicate, and it never works. So we have to do this in order to nurture the team so we can go back to work and actually get things done. And it's a tricky balance, again, even in the best of times. And then, you deal with what we've dealt with for the last couple of years, it just makes it that much more challenging.
Yeah, it's powerful.
Just a minute, Niall. Mike, you mentioned beautifully the soft skills, and the number one trend I would say that I see here at HR Tech is the ability for organizations to focus and mine and harness and process those skills. 56%, according to McKinsey, 56% of employees currently right now are building their skills outside of an organization. And whether that's an hourly person, a professional level skill set, they're building their skills outside the organization. So if you don't serve me up the skills that I want to build, I'm going to go build them elsewhere through an informal, Coursera, whatever it is, right? So all these software vendors are responding to the need to find the skill set, because unemployment is record history across the globe in terms of trying to find talent. To your point on soft skills are being now politically divided in terms of, I think these are hard skills for leadership. We need the future leaders for the future of work. So I'd be curious, Jim, too, in terms of your organization, how you all view, or you personally view, these leadership skills that are so needed in your work.
Absolutely. I think the difficulty that every organization faces is that the quote unquote hard skills are independently verified by your degree or by your role title. The great unknown and the great hazard in trying to recruit people is what is their performance level at all these range of soft skills, and we probably don't even codify them to the extent that we should when we by comparison with the quote unquote hard skills. So it is an area that needs a lot more thought and work, I believe, because ultimately those are the skills that build leadership capability and ultimately deliver performances, as you said, Mike.
Completely, yeah. And I always struggle when people talk about soft skills, because obviously coming from the psychology background, I'm always looking at how the brain works and how our behavior impacts on people. And I would have done a lot of work with coaches in the sporting world, talking to them about how their messaging impacts on the people around them, and understanding that communication, and this is whether it's corporate or sport, communication is at the key of everything. Because if you're openly communicating and drawing people in, you build a level of trust, and then people will go that extra yard for you. And I always share a very simple story of my niece, my goddaughter. I met her for a coffee one day. She's an amazing kid, but she's not a kid anymore, in fairness. But she was working. She was doing her master's, and she was working in a jewelry store while she was working her way through college. And we were having the coffee, and she got a phone call, and it was from the boss in the jewelry store to say that a couple of people had gone sick and whatever, and could she come in and cover a few hours because they were short. And she said, no problem, I'll be there in 20 minutes, because we were just down the road having coffee. And when we got off the phone, and I was saying, good on you, I like that your day off and you're going to go in and help them out. And she said, yeah, but if it was the other manager ringing me, I was sorry, I'm out of town.
Yeah.
And it's that simplicity of that relationship meant that she was a more valuable employee to them because the manager and her had that relationship. Totally. And I think it really, that's a very simplification of a more broad story. But one thing I do think is interesting, and I'm going to throw this open to you guys, you can choose who wants to answer it. But what I do think is interesting is there are organizations who I mean, there's hundreds of millions of dollars spent on leadership training every year. The vast majority of it has little or no impact. So we know there's all these kind of different things that can tell us the great leadership traits. We know about trust, and we know about being vulnerable, and we know all these things. One of the things I see regularly in the leaders I speak to is people who genuinely want to embrace these things, but they really don't know where to start. Mm-hmm. Because it hasn't been ingrained in it hasn't been how they came up through the ranks. It hasn't been their experience of leadership. And for you guys, working with someone like that, or Jim, what you've seen, and I know that you are somebody who is very kind of forward thinking in your approach to leadership. But what's your advice on where you start when you want to do these things better?
Gosh, that's a tough question. I'm inclined to think that you really need to look at what drives your own values and think about that and what. I'll give you a simple example. I was thinking recently about an experience I had as a very young executive when I was working with one of my first jobs, and I got into working late on a Friday evening, the CEO started this project, and he, for some reason, pulled me in to try and help him. And I had done some preparatory work that he wasn't happy with at all. And so the conversation started in a very difficult circumstance for me, and we worked through it, and worked late on Friday. At the end, this is a very long time ago, and even though I am very young, but at the end of it, he turned around to me and said, "Would you like to go for a drink?" And I was genuinely probably too scared to say otherwise. I was delighted. And we went across the road from the office and had a drink, and we talked about sport, and we talked about, and that stuck with me as an example of somebody who was a very traditional CEO, and I had been through this experience where I was intimidated because I didn't feel my performance was good. He was frustrated. We worked through it, and then there was this human person who valued me as an equivalent, and we went and we talked about sport for half an hour. And that kind of idea of, even though I was very junior and he was very senior, I learned so much in that little encounter in terms of how you treat people with respect, you categorize what's the professional, what's the human values. And I think, in many respects, just thinking about how you have been treated by different colleagues, or different peers, or different bosses over your career, and what had an impact on you, can actually be very revealing in terms of how you deal with others. I don't know whether that answers your question at all, but that's
it's a lovely story regardless. No, it does. It is that kind of that understanding of, we're all human. Like, that's the bottom line, and we're all, you'd like to think that by and large, anybody working in an organization together is working towards a similar goal, which is
and just to build that a little bit, I would have, subsequent to that, because I was treated that way, I would have done anything for that guy. You know what I mean? And it had big impact on me, and so it was very impactful.
Yeah, and we did in our last panel discussion. There's a friend of mine, a guy called Benny Fowler, was on the call, and Benny won a Super Bowl with the Denver Broncos, and he works in the kind of coaching sphere now. But he spoke about his last contract was with New Orleans, down with the Saints, and he spoke about the coach he had down in New Orleans, and he was, like the average NFL career is 4 years. Benny had played in the NFL for 10 years. So there was a certain amount of resilience in getting that far, but also in the fact that, this wonderful world of sport where you hit 30 and suddenly you're an old man, it's kind of ridiculous. But he is coming towards the end of his career in football. And the coach sits him down and tells him that, he's not going to get a lot of game time, but he's going to get kind of special teams kind of stuff. And the coach basically lays out exactly what he's going to get, what he can expect, from the team that year. Benny had more respect for that coach than most any other coach he worked for, because he had the care, I suppose, and the empathy, or whatever you want to call it, to sit down and be honest with him and set his expectations exactly where he needed to be, so that it wasn't that some guy was promising him the world and then letting him down every week. It was, I know exactly where I'm at, so I know now I need to work really hard to prove to him that I deserve that chance, and I'm going to. And it was really interesting to me that it was a coach who gave him probably the least amount of game time he got in his career, but a coach that he has huge respect for. And sometimes we think that we need to have nice conversations, and sometimes just being bloody honest with somebody, they will totally respect that, because at least you know where you stand.
Yeah.
And that's a big thing. And one of the things that we do with Pep Talk, one of the things we do in our product is we do this thing called a team check-in. And what we do with that is we basically, a leader takes a team into our app or our platform, and they check in where they're all feeling, the kind of sentiment in the team in that moment. And off the back of that, the manager then has some information on where their team are at. And sometimes as a manager, you can think everything's awesome. And next thing you see that everybody's anxious or everybody's checked out, or whatever the case may be. And, you know, you're kind of like, Jesus, I thought we were having brilliant meetings. And you go, no, you were talking great in the meetings. You know, did you know what I mean? But at least it gives you a perspective on somewhere to go. And we try to kind of deliver solutions and team talks and kind of give them some information that helps them to figure out a path to improve that sentiment in the team. But by and large, and Mike, I come back to you on this, I love listening to you talk, because you're to use Jen's word, there's lovely eloquence, but there's also common sense in what you're saying. And unfortunately, common sense isn't all that common. But it's that kind of, when you're there, and going back to the how do we build this if you don't really know, when you're working with a coach and you're working with an executive and you point out, you know, all of these key skills and the ideas around intentionality and empathy and care, what if they turn to you and say, Mike, I absolutely understand what you're saying, I completely agree with you, but like, you don't know the people who are working for me. Jesus, right. If I start opening up this cuddly stuff to them, where the hell do we go from here? You know, like, how do you get them to buy the message, I suppose, is the question.
I mean, look, every environment's different, and this stuff doesn't happen in a vacuum. So it is easier said than done. I mean, I think related to that, and also the question that you asked before, Niall, my perspective on this is, I think, somewhat simple, although not easy, in that what really works. You're right. There's all this money that gets invested into things like leadership development, even like DE&I, what we were talking about earlier, and they're complex. And a lot of the initiatives with good intention don't necessarily work or have the impact that is desired. And when I'm working with an executive or a team or an organization, I think if the people involved are really committed to their own personal growth, like for real, not just so that they do a good job at the job, but in general. I mean, it might sound strange, but it's like, do you have a therapist? Do you have a coach? Are you working on yourself and unpacking a lot of the things that you struggle with? Because those things are going to follow you everywhere. It doesn't matter who you're working for or what you're doing. We all have a certain responsibility, if we're going to be good, productive, healthy human beings, to do some work on ourselves. And, you know, if people are bought into that, great. Sometimes people come to that through some pain or through some challenge or through some difficulty, but that's number one. Number two, with the team, it's like, are we creating situations where we can facilitate people getting to know each other better? Jim, your story about going out for a drink, I mean, it's like, how many times have we all seen it happen where it's like, again, the big, fancy, very expensive offsite and all of the slides and all the things. And what was most useful is when we all sat around at the bar and everybody got real about what was going on, but it helped facilitate conversations, right? We talk about DE&I. Part of it is like, if we get close to people who are different than us and we get curious about their experience, be like, oh my gosh, I never thought what it must be like to be that person or live that life or walk around in that body or whatever. Then we have more empathy and understanding, not from a slide or from a research study, but from real lived experience. And then ultimately, if that facilitates some sense of real trust and connection, right now, your story about the football player, it's like he trusted and respected his coach because he told him the truth. Not because he said, you're going to play and you're going to be a star and you're going to be my best guy. And he's like, great. And then let down. It's like, no, here's what I think is going to happen. So those things, it's like doing the personal work, facilitating the relationships, and actually figuring out how to build trust, which is a lot easier said than done. Those things will ultimately, I think, lead leaders and teams to be successful. I mean, even as someone who writes books and does a lot of research, like the best book in the world isn't going to do it if the person or the people involved aren't really bought into actually doing the work and making the changes.
Yeah, and I think that just sums it up, really, doesn't it? And I'm very conscious of the time. You guys have been so generous with your time, especially Mike and Jen coming to us from ridiculous hours of the morning, and Jen having had to dodge the Irish fraternity in the hotel in Vegas at 6 o'clock in the morning, which is a story for another day. But if I could ask you guys one question to finish with, and Jen, I'll start with you. We've talked a lot about the things that need to happen. We've talked a lot about empathy and care and intentionality. And what, if there was one thing that you could see done, I'm a great believer in any organization that you're working with, regardless of how big the changes need to happen. I always think about, well, what one thing can we do today to make a difference, to take us on that journey? What one thing can we do next week and next month? And what it's, you go back to that Al Pacino famous 1-inch motivational thing on any given Sunday. But just focusing on, sometimes we get caught up in thinking, oh my God, this is such a huge change for how we do work, that it's so big, we're not even going to bother because we couldn't possibly do it. But if you actually start to chip away, what would be the one thing that you would kind of say as a starting point for people who really want to change in their organization?
My favorite quote in the world is by Mother Teresa, who says, we cannot do great things. We can only do small things with great love. And when we think about the small things as an organization that we can tackle, it's one thing at a time. And recognizing that we have an exciting workforce today of humans, and we have 5 different generations for the first time in our lives in the world of work. Everyone learns differently. We have learners from neurodiverse to ethnic. And so it's going to take several different trials and errors. There's no one way. And so encouraging folks to, as Mike, you said so beautifully, have conversations with people that are doing them. It's one of the best learning ways for all different types of learners there, and to try new and different things. That's my hope.
I love that. Have you guys got anything you want to add to that?
I'll add something small that just from my own experience that I've done recently is just trying to dig into understanding bias in a more in-depth way, just by doing a few online surveys that are anonymous, but because it is uncomfortable, and it's not something that you are going to promote. But it really gives you a deep insight as to recognize that we all have biases, but just to dig into that, I just found it very revealing in terms of just challenging how you think about different things, and recognizing that we all have those challenges, and that we have to address them. So that it's, again, as something that's practical and one small step forward, it's something that I would encourage people to do.
Love that.
Yeah. Well, and I think I love, Jen and Jim, what you just said, because I think it really gets to the core of what we're talking about here. And, Niall, I heard Oprah Winfrey say something years ago that to me kind of epitomizes what I think great leadership's about, and great teamwork and building relationships. She said, I've interviewed thousands and thousands of people in my career, everybody, presidents and prime ministers and celebrities and children and people who've gone through tragedies and people who've done heroic things. And she said, just about every single person I've ever interviewed asks me some version of the same question when the interview's over. The camera shuts off, they lean over and they say, how'd I do? Or was that okay? And she said, early in my career, I used to be really confused by this question, especially when I was sitting across from someone who's very successful and accomplished. And I'd be wondering, are they really that insecure? Do they really need my validation? Like, what is that? Why are they asking me how they did? She goes, then I realized something. They're not actually asking me how they did. She said, you know what they're really asking me? Did you see me? Did you hear me? Did what I say matter to you? And she said, and I agree with her, I think everybody's asking those questions, especially these days. So for leaders, or for all of us, if we can be the kind of people in the midst of everything that's going on, where we can actually slow down enough to connect and see people and hear people and let them know not just what they say, but who they are matters. Jen, to your point, like, that's doing those small things with great love, right? Like, that's taking that intentionality, that care, that compassion, and channeling it into the present moment with the real people we interact with, even if we're only interacting with them over Zoom. We can do that. We actually know how to do that. And that just takes some intentionality and some awareness. So that's what I think is most important.
Love it. Thank you all for taking part. If you'll bear with me for one moment, I just want to remind people we're running a leadership workshop in Dublin on October 12th. The opportunity, I believe there's a waiting list open now. The numbers are pretty full, but if anybody's interested, you'll find the details on our website, and there'll be a link to it on this LinkedIn post. Jen, Jim, Mike, thank you so much. What a fabulous conversation. Fascinating stuff all around. Look forward to catching up with all of you in person in the near future. Thanks a million, guys. And
Thank you all.
Mike, I hope your days improve from here.
Thanks, Niall. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Niall.
Thank you all.